Many people who don't even read the Bible are familiar with the idea of the Good Samaritan. I mean, we have Good Samaritan Hospital, we have Good Samaritan laws that protect people who take reasonable steps to help somebody, say, who's in a traffic accident, to protect them from being sued. And even though many people are familiar with this story, I would say that a lot of people aren't familiar with the question that precipitated the story, because you'd have to read a little bit more in context than just the parable. And those of you who maybe need to be refamiliarized with this, if you could look in Luke chapter 10, and we see there that there was a man who was asking Jesus a question, a lawyer, and he said to Jesus, "What do I need to do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus turned that question around on him, as he often did, and said, "What does the law say?" And this man said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." And then in verse 29 of Luke 10, it says, "But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, 'Who is my neighbor?'" So this man had answered Jesus right. This is what the law says: love God with all that you are, love your neighbor as yourself. And rather than saying, okay, now I have the answer to my question, I'm going to go and do it, he wanted to justify himself. And so he says, well, who's my neighbor? Who is this person that I have to love? And so Jesus went on to tell the story of the Good Samaritan. It's recorded for us in Luke chapter 10. Jesus replied and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance a priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion, and he came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend when I return, I will repay you.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands?" Jesus asked the lawyer. And I think when we think about this story, and in terms of it answering that question, who is my neighbor, I would say that the answer to that question, who is my neighbor, is the person in need who God puts in our path. There were 3 people in that story to whom that man should have been a neighbor: the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan. But only the Samaritan chose to see him as a neighbor. And then Jesus' question was really a little bit different than the question that the lawyer asked. Jesus' question was, who proved to be a neighbor? Not who is the neighbor, but who proved to be a neighbor. And the lawyer said, the one who showed mercy toward him. Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do the same." You know, I think as we've been considering this idea of what can we do in this broken world to participate in God's redemptive purposes, the answer that we would get from this story that Jesus told is that we can show mercy to the people that God puts in our paths. That we can be the person who has compassion. We can be the person who goes out of their way to help. We can be the person who even uses our resources, even though it costs us something, but we're willing to bear that cost because we are showing mercy. We are being a neighbor to our neighbors. And so I would encourage you today, as you're thinking about maybe some of the issues that are going on in our country currently, and we tend to think about them in very abstract ways, sometimes because that doesn't require us to do anything. So maybe instead of thinking about the people who are being detained, which is certainly worthy of thinking about. Maybe instead of thinking about, whether the way things are being done are correct or incorrect, instead of participating in what might be an intellectual activity, let's think, who is the person that God has put in front of me that I can show mercy to? I don't need to know whether they're documented or undocumented. I don't need to know whether they're a Democrat or a Republican. I don't need to know whether they're rich or poor. I don't need to know if they're educated or uneducated. It shouldn't matter to me what color their skin is. If God has placed a person in need in front of us, in our lives, then he expects us to be a neighbor to that person. And that's something that we can do to participate in God's redemptive purposes.